Everyone. Welcome to tonight's town hall. My name is Christine Bojanowski, and I'm joined by Dr. Ariel Berlinski as we discuss tonight's topic, the CF drug development pipeline. Dr. Marty Solomon from UAB is also joining us to help moderate the session and field some questions for us. I know that he's kind of just said he was going to lurk in the background, but he'll be an important and integral part of tonight's session. So before we get started, some important words of thanks. First, of course, thank you to everyone who is tuning in live this evening, and to those of you who will be taking the time to catch the recording that we will make available for everyone. I'd also like to acknowledge the Town Hall Planning Committee, which is led by Dr. Marty Solomon, and the CFF for supporting this important series. These are our disclosures. And for those of you that may be joining us for the first time, as well as serving as a refresher, I did want to take a few moments to orient everyone to Zoom and to the Zoom platform that we're using for this webinar tonight. And that, oh no. I'm sorry, the little slide is not coming up, but I can kind of walk you through it. First, we recommend that you use the speaker view. This will allow you to get an audio and a video of the person speaking, but it'll be in a smaller video so as to not block the screen and the slides that we're wanting to share with you. On the bottom toolbar, you'll see a couple of different options. One, you'll see on the left, you'll see a chat button that will allow you to interact kind of offline or in a more casual way with other attendees and with the panelists. However, if you want to submit a question that will be presented to the group in the formal Q&A, please use the Q&A icon, and we'll make sure that we get those addressed. There are some other features. For example, if you would like to use a Spanish language caption, please just select show captions, and then the transcript in Spanish will populate for you. So moving on to the objectives of this town hall series. This town hall was really envisioned to accomplish these three main objectives. The first objective is to familiarize you with the clinical research process and with the Southeast CF Research Cooperative, or SRC. The second objective is to familiarize you with how clinical researchers protect your safety and your privacy, and we keep those things as a priority. And then the final objective is to inform everyone about the most up-to-date clinical studies and new areas of CF research, and importantly, how you can become involved. As I mentioned before, this is a series. We have 4 town halls planned. We've had the first town hall already in August that was covering informed consent and the protection of your safety. The second town hall we had earlier this month that introduced you to the SRC and the research referral process. Tonight is our third town hall on the CF drug development pipeline and on the phases of clinical trials. And then later on in October, we will have a town hall introducing gene therapies in CF. So make sure to tune in for that. As I mentioned earlier, for tonight, this is our agenda. We'll be going over the basics of clinical trials in the CF pipeline, and we'll be exploring the pipeline of new drug therapies. With that, I will turn things over to Dr. Ariel Berlinski.
Thank you, Christine. It's really a real pleasure to be here tonight and share with you some words about the clinical trial process and the CF research pipeline. Next. So as I said, we will review the clinical trial processes, and we sort of introduce you to the CF pipeline. Next. So what do clinical trials study? And that's sort of the first question that comes to mind. And, you know, there are new medications that become available or combination of new medications. There are new diagnostic tests that are developed, new medical devices. Also, there's new ways of using existing medications. That's an example of inhaled antibiotics that were available for IV, and then they were sort of reformulated to be given via the inhale route. Also, there's new ways to change behaviors that can result in better health. And finally, clinical trials also look at new ways to improve quality of life of people with acute or chronic conditions. And that has become, I think, a good evolution of what we are studying in clinical trials. Next. So the first question, or the second question, will be why are those trials necessary? And we talk about new therapies, new devices, or procedures. And the first question is, will they hurt us? And this is what we define as safety. And you'll see that theme throughout the different phases of clinical trials. Also, it not only should be safe, but also should be efficacious, because we can take a medicine that doesn't hurt us, but also doesn't help us. And that increases the burden of care that we are well aware that is very high in patients with cystic fibrosis. So will they help us? And this would define that as efficacy. Next. But before clinical trials start, there are a couple of periods or phases that occur. Number one is the research for looking for a drug, for the right drug for a specific condition. And I think that a good example of this is the research for the modulators. So as a result of this initial research, some components were just obtained, and then the next phase becomes to study them in either cells or also in animals, and that's what the preclinical studies consist of. And once there's data and seems like this is an effective therapy, then we move on to clinical trials. Next. And as I said, there are several phases. We describe 4 phases. And the first one, it's typically it's a small group of subjects. And in most situations are healthy volunteers who participate in those trials, but in certain conditions and in certain type of studies. It might also be people who have the condition that's being treated. And the goal is several-fold. Number one, is it safe? Number two, we sort of need to learn how much medicine and what is the optimal route of delivery. Is it by mouth? Is it inhaled? Is it intravenous? We also try to identify side effects, and we want to have an initial understanding of how these medicines will affect the body of the participants. But keep in mind that these are small number of subjects, so some of the things that may appear later might not be evident in this phase 1. The phase 2 is kind of an expansion, and treatments are given to larger groups of people with numbers around 100 to 300. And really now we're trying to look for efficacy. So, and then to expand further on the safety of these compounds. So we try to learn more with larger numbers about the safety, but now we're trying to see, does it really help me when I take this medication? Next, please. phase 3 now just moves to larger groups of people, and that might range between 300 and 3,000. And here we're trying to confirm the efficacy. And as we are studying more subjects, some of the side effects that might have low prevalence might become apparent now that we have increased the number of subjects that have been exposed to the medication. And we also just want to compare that when in some occasions to what's the standard of care is at that time or other treatments that are also available, so we can establish where they are as good as the others or better. Finally, phase 4 trials occur after the drug is approved. And the reason for that, again, is because some of the side effects that have low prevalence, that means that occurs in very low numbers, might really just start appearing now that the drug is being given to large number of patients. And here, safety is the main driver of this phase. Next, please. So these these phases of clinical trial have a different duration, and we'll start with phase 1 that might last several months. And on the right hand of the table, you have the percentage of compounds that move on to the next phase. So about 70% will move on to next phase. The phase 2 trials might last several months to up to 2 years, but now the number of compounds that are moving to the next phase, yes, it's about a third of them. So you see that we start with lots of compounds or therapies, and then as we are studying them, we are sort of, in a way, discovering those that work and those that don't, and those that might even cause harm. Phase 3 trials, and these are very important for the approval process of medications in the United States, and those might last between 1 and 4 years. And again, about a third of them might get approved. And then phase 4 are might last several years. Some of that is imposed by the Food and Drug Administration to the new medications. But also, as we use this medication clinically, we also report side effects that have not been described before, maybe, or that as we use it in numbers, it becomes apparent that there can be just some problems with using this medication. Next. I would like to illustrate what I just discussed with data from the elexacaftor, tezacaftor, ivacaftor clinical trial process for patients older than 12 years of age. And this information was kindly provided by Vertex. And as you could see, phase 1 and phase 2 started in January 17, lasted to March 18, about a year, and they had about 101 subjects in phase 1, 122 subjects in phase 2. We move on to phase 3 that lasted about a year, and for one study and about 400 subjects, and then another study that lasted just a few months and had 113 subjects. And then, as you see, once the drug got approved on phase 4, you had about almost 9,000 people with CF that are exposed to the drug. And I think that probably for many other drugs, this schedule is is not as fast as this one. I think that when you look at the drug development process, this has gone, I would say, extremely fast. And I think because it was built on a lot of work that had been happening with similar compounds in this domain. Next, please. So I'm going to switch gears now to talk for a minute about the CF research pipeline. And when we talk about the CF research pipeline, we refer to the graphical display of where treatments are from stages of preclinical development to approval and availability to patients. On a review on July of this year, 6 categories were present, and you have genetic therapies with 12 active studies and 2 discontinued, restore CFTR protein, 9 active, 15 discontinued, mucociliary clearance, 4 active and 9 discontinued, anti-inflammatory therapies, 2 active and 11 discontinued, anti-infectives, 20 active, 7 discontinued, and nutritional GI, 5 active and 3 discontinued. So as you could see, and we're going to see that in a minute, there are many compounds that start, and not all make it to the availability to patient to drug approval. On the next slide is an animation of this process that reports about 20 years of work of the CF Foundation Therapeutics pipeline, and you see gene therapy, restore CFTR function, mucociliary clearance, anti-inflammatory, anti-infective, and nutritional. And you will see as these studies are reaching the availability to patients at the top on red, and some are disappearing because they didn't make the cut. What was initially something promising ended up not giving the results. And again, we're looking for safety and we're looking for efficacy. So could you please just run it?
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
Great. So this is a sort of brief introduction to the pipeline, and now just Dr. Bojanowski will expand and help you navigate the clinical trial information about cystic fibrosis and discuss some key issues on some areas that are up and coming. Dr. Bojanowski.
Thank you. So we will save all the questions for the end of the presentation. So everyone, again, hello. I'm Christine Bojanowski. I'm an assistant professor at Tulane University here in New Orleans. I'm the co-director of the adult CF program here and one of the investigators for our TDN site. So jumping off from where Dr. Belinsky finished his talk, I'm really excited to explore and kind of delve a little bit deeper into the pipeline with you. As he mentioned, there are 6 main categories when you're looking at the CF research pipeline online. You can organize your searches by one of these 6 categories. Tonight, I'm mainly going to focus on these top portions here, with a particular focus on the anti-infectives and the anti-inflammatory areas. I'll also touch on some other areas that I found to be of high interest. The remainder of these categories I'll leave for our final town hall. So if you are not familiar with the drug development pipeline or the clinical trial finder, I strongly encourage you to check them out tonight. You can find them on cff.org, and then all you need to do is click on the research, I believe it's the research and clinical trials tab, and you'll be able to scroll down and you'll see the drug development pipeline and the how to find a clinical trial right here. And you can just go answer some questions here and then explore the pipeline a little bit further. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was anti-infectives. And this is a major ongoing area of research. And why is this? I think this probably is a pretty well appreciated area by those in the audience, from just recognizing that this is a major driver of health decline, quality of life issues for people with CF. Long-term lung infections with different things like bacteria, viruses, and fungi are a serious and major complication and an ongoing threat for people with CF. And in fact, like recurrent infections and the inflammation that accompanies them really drive lung tissue damage. And why is this such a big issue in people with CF? So people with CF are maybe more prone, are likely more prone to infection due to a couple of different factors. The first is abnormally thick and sticky mucus. And the second part of this also is that the airways in people with CF and this abnormal mucus don't have the same germ-fighting properties. So because of this threat, the CFF launched the Infection Research Initiative, and that was in 2018 when they first established this. So dedicating more than $100 million, the CF Foundation has really focused efforts to improve the detection, treatment, and outcomes of CF-related infections. So what types of research are being done? Tons of studies are being done on understanding microorganisms, how they interact with one another, determining who is at greatest risk for prolonged infections or complications from these different types of infections. Areas of research have also been dedicated to improving detection of infection and the diagnosis, optimizing treatment, deciding when to treat, how to treat, and what medications to use, coming up with new treatments, so new formulations of drugs, and looking at existing antibiotics or other drugs in new ways that may be helpful to fight infection in people with CF. And then we're also looking at how to address drug-resistant bacteria, how to deal with having a long history of being on antibiotics frequently, and looking at different functions of therapies and new and innovative therapies, like looking at bacteriophage therapies, for example. As part of this, I mean, just a couple of things to touch on while we move on. And, you know, what types of bugs are being focused on in the areas of anti-infectives? So the ones that we'd probably recognize, Pseudomonas, different non-tuberculous mycobacteria, Staph aureus, different multiple organisms, co-infections, Burkholderia sopacia, steno, different viruses, fungi, and as I mentioned, the bacteriophages, which are really interesting and exciting potential treatment option coming down the pipeline. So this is an example of what my search field would look like when I looked up anti-infective active trials on the research pipeline. So you'll see what phases they're in, be it in preclinical phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and 2 patients. So these are only the ones that are active and open to enrolling currently, that when I just did a quick zoom in on this. So for example, here, One of the drugs that I wanted just to highlight is has been moving through both phases 1 and phase 2 is IV gallium. So what is IV gallium? It's a molecule that's very similar to iron, and it's been shown in other studies in the lab, for example, to have really strong effect against Pseudomonas. Now, other trials that are now, this is in phase 1, for example, there are ongoing studies looking at the use of IV gallium, not just in Pseudomonas, but now looking at its use in non-tuberculous Mycobacterium avium complex, or MAC infection, and Mycobacterium abscessus. And this would be for people that have not yet been treated. So just to cover some of the general eligibility criteria for those anti-infective studies. Now, every study will have its own nuances and its own specifications, but these are kind of general points that you can think about if you're thinking about whether or not you, or as yourself, your friend, or one of the people that you care for in clinic may be a suitable candidate for one of these studies. So for anti-infective studies, you usually have to have positive respiratory cultures, either through sputum or through throat culture swab. Depends on the study. Many of the ones that are available are the ones that I mentioned, for example, or studies that are potentially available with bacteria and viruses that I mentioned, for example, Pseudomonas. Typically, the studies have no underlying mutation requirements. You usually want to enroll or look at these studies a little bit further if you have stable lung function, so you're not frequently exacerbating, you're not currently in an exacerbation. And a lot of times we like to avoid looking at these different types of drugs in very severe lung disease. So usually these studies will have an FEV1% predicted minimum. Typically around 40 or 45 is what you'll see, but that number can certainly vary. Another type of trial that is that I wanted to highlight is the STOP 360 IP22. This some of you may be familiar with the STOP program platform. This has been developed to look at and design different trials that will help evaluate the best way to treat pulmonary exacerbations in people with CF, typically in the setting of positive Pseudomonas cultures. So some of you may have heard of the STOP2 trial, which was published within the past couple of years, or came out within the past couple of years, that looked at the optimal duration of treatments, optimal duration and timing of IV treatments for exacerbations. Now, what the STOP 360 trial is looking at is comparing the use of one antibiotic to treatment with 2 different antibiotics. So 1 versus 2 different IV antibiotics. And the point of this would be to learn whether or not there's a large difference in ultimate lung function and symptom improvement between different groups of people that are needing IV antibiotics for an exacerbation. So this is a really exciting study that's coming out and will be really helpful to help guide how we treat and manage exacerbations in the future. So this is kind of a unique study. People are eligible 6 years of age and older. There are no underlying mutation requirements. There are no underlying FEV1% predicted or lung function requirements. The requirement is positive cultures for Pseudomonas. So these are all studies. The ones I'll highlight are also available in our region. And so you'll be able to look at where these are and what centers are conducting these studies through the clinical trial finder on cff.org as well. So moving on to anti-inflammatories. So what is inflammation? So inflammation is a part of your body's normal immune system response to something that's harmful or irritating. Typically, you get a rush of white blood cells, blood, and fluids that are there to help protect and fight off this harmful stimulus. And you'll get some tissue swelling associated with that. In the lungs, however, if the swelling continues and is too much, it can lead to narrowed airways, and that can cause symptoms like cough and make it even harder to breathe. So why is it a problem? So in general, inflammation, as I mentioned before, is a normal part of your host defense, a natural response to fight infection, irritating stimulus, or anything like that. But after some time, your body needs to shut off that inflammation, because if you go too much down that pathway, it'll cause tissue destruction and further irritation and scarring of your airways, for example. And that's one of the big issues here, is a problem of balance. And so in the airways of people with CF, there's really too much inflammation. So the approach with anti-inflammatory studies and therapeutics is to either prevent the inflammation from starting or stop it, and definitely stop it from going way too far on one extreme. So these are just some of the current treatments and clinical trials that you'll find if you search this on the drug pipeline. These are both the 2 studies that are in phase 2 are actually both now closed to enrollment. Going over some of the current treatments that you may have heard of or may have been exposed to, maybe taking yourself, different antibiotics such as azithromycin that's used for anti-inflammatory properties in people that have Pseudomonas chronically in their lungs. Sometimes, and people have looked at, or sometimes people have taken and have needed to have steroids or high-dose steroids, and steroids have been looked at in various different studies. However, this isn't ideal because there are lots of different complications that happen with steroids when it comes to wound healing, blood sugar control, bone density health, for example. High doses of ibuprofen, which is a non-steroid anti-inflammatory drug, have also been looked at, mainly in children, not really supported in the adult population. This is really limited, largely due to bad GI side effects. So some of the current trial approaches, and when you're thinking about like how you're developing these drugs, or the drugs that are being identified that will come onto the pipeline you may hear about, usually they work in one of 3 different ways. Either they're anti-inflammatory, so they stop or prevent the inflammation from starting, usually from the onset. They reduce the production of molecules that increase inflammation, or they block the function of something like neutrophil elastase. So looking at, I had mentioned neutrophil elastase and I had highlighted it on the last page, but targeting neutrophil inflammation is one of the main areas of focus in anti-inflammatory research. Neutrophil-dominated diseases include things like cystic fibrosis, COPD, non-cystic fibrosis, bronchiectasis, COVID-19, even chronic rhinosinusitis. So what this little cartoon is showing here, this little display that I have, is you have neutrophils, and these neutrophils are kind of primed with these little granules, and they have these neutrophil serine proteases. And when these neutrophils are activated, they release different neutrophil elastases, proteinases, capsaicin G, for example. So these different serine proteases that really serve the function of revving up inflammation, increasing inflammation, recruiting more activators of inflammation, different cytokines and chemokines that are a part of host defense. But the issue again goes back to this balance. So it's really the neutrophil inflammation in the CF lung is oftentimes just so largely out of scale. And so this is a really important area of focus. The DPPI or DPP1 inhibitor is something that you'll probably be hearing more about. This works here, and it works to impact how the serine proteases are activated. So it will stop the inflammation cascade at this point. These agents have been looked at in non-CF bronchiectasis and in many other diseases. And recently a phase 2 trial in CF just closed to enrollment, but the results are very promising. So it will be looking like it's moving towards a phase 3. So I'm sure we'll be hearing more about that. So moving on to nutritional and GI, as well as other endocrinology studies. So this is when I looked up nutritional GI in the drug pipeline. And this is a nice way of just highlighting what you might see when you're searching through this on your own. This is, when drugs go all the way through to patients, and you'll get the check marks at the end. And as Dr. Berlinski really nicely went over, not all drugs make it all the way through the pipeline and get to patients. So some of these, you'll see their progress and where they were stopped or discontinued along the way. So those will be in gray. And so these are some of the ones that are ongoing and actively enrolling in the nutritional and GI space, many different types of lipase and pancreatic enzyme formulations that are being looked at and explored. One of the main things I wanted to bring to everyone's attention that you might not find so easily when you're just quickly looking through the CFF trials finder or through the pipeline, but if you look at the cff.org research and clinical trials, and you look at specifically research and then cystic fibrosis related diabetes, you'll come across a really nice webinar that was posted. And I would suggest everyone take a listen to it. This is just an excerpt from it. So of course, CF related diabetes is a really important entity and something that we deal with in the clinic. Nearly 50% of all adults with CF develop CF-related diabetes. And right now, the only drug that we have that's approved for treatment is insulin, right? And so we have insulin in addition to trying to live, keeping a healthy and active lifestyle, monitoring our diet. But in CF, that is not even going to guarantee you just a consistency in your blood sugar levels that is really marked by a number of different highs and lows and a lot of complex management, especially in the setting of things like exacerbations. So one of the really exciting things that I think we're going to be hearing more about in the near future is the bionic pancreas. This is Melissa Putnam here. She's a little cut off, but she's in the Boston area. And she headed a pilot study in CF, in people with CF, and then a larger trial out of the Boston area, looking at the use of these bionic, of the bionic pancreas. So basically, it uses an insulin pump and a continuous glucose monitor. And in that, it automatically adjusts the insulin delivery. There are two different ways. One is just insulin and one that's insulin and glucagon, which addresses more of just kind of hormonal balance when it comes to CF-related diabetes. So it's really neat. It is continuously adapting. It will figure out and tweak the specific insulin needs of each user. You don't need to carb count. And in the trials, if you look, there was a big study done in type 1 diabetics, not people with CF, but the results for people with type 1 diabetes were really positive. The amount of time in the goal glucose range with the use of the bionic pancreas was significantly higher than in people that were just managing their blood sugars with insulin alone. So this is really exciting and something for everyone to kind of keep a lookout for. The other thing that I wanted to mention was the role of observational studies. These are critically important. These don't really fit in the typical phases. It's not a therapeutic that's necessarily going through. This won't be on the drug development pipeline, but you will be able to find them on the CF trial finder. So observational studies are critically important. They're critically important to help us as clinicians and researchers better understand issues that we're facing in the clinics, to better understand disease processes and what the needs are. And these studies are really important to direct the preclinical studies and the further phase studies to bring drug therapeutics back to people living with CF. So these are just some important ones that are active and all active in our region. So there are several different sites that are participating in these trials. And if you can consider it, I would strongly encourage you to do so. So these are some examples. The Mayflower study, which is looking at fetal and maternal outcomes in women with CF on modulator therapies during their pregnancy. Looking at Strong CF that looks at physical measurements, BMI, body composition, and bone density scans. There are studies that are really important and informative studies, looking at things like just rare mutations and understanding what rare mutations and what the clinical spectrum of disease is there. Predict, looking at non-tuberculous mycobacterium outcomes, and looking at outcomes and just colorectal cancer screening in people with CF. And then here are two other ones as well, looking at sweat chloride and also looking at the effects of CFT modulators in infants and younger children. So again, just I wanted to close and encourage everyone, hopefully a little bit of your curiosity and sparks were ignited to kind of explore these tools that are available to you if you haven't already. So this is a clinical trial finder. You can really do so much with this. You can search by several different factors, and they're listed here on the left. You can search by different keywords, study status, if it's open, closed, enrolling. For example, location, you couldn't put in your zip code and you can determine how far you are willing to travel, if it's 5 miles or 500 miles. You can put in some specifics that are unique to you, like your age, your FEV1% predicted, or your lung function, the mutations, the genetic mutations that are being carried. That may help narrow out of these 206 studies that are available there, some that might be of interest specifically towards you or for you. And then you can also click by therapeutic approach, like we were talking about the anti-infective, anti-inflammatory, looking at mucociliary clearance, genetic therapies, protein modulation, etc. So lots of fun information and lots of great things that are coming our way. And with that, we will move on to questions.
Great. Thank you, Drs. Berlinski and Bojanowski, for great presentations and a lot of information. I'm going to start. We've got one Q&A. The first question is there any update that you all can provide about nonsense mutation modulators? And I'm happy to answer that in the next gene therapy and other trial session, or we can go ahead and give a prelude to it now if you all would like to respond to that.
Dr. Berlinski, do you have anything you wanted to add? I would love to just include this for the follow-up session.
Great. I'll put a non-live answer as a prelude, and we'll talk about some more of these things next time. Then great. Yep. Great. We have some other questions that kind of came in by other means, and I wanted to direct those to you all. The first question I wanted to pose to both of you is, if someone is considering a clinical research but doesn't have a lot of experience with that, but is doing relatively well on or off a CFTR modulator, what should be the motivation for patients to continue to participate in research or to consider new participation in new research avenues?
So when I'm discussing these issues with my patients or other potential candidates, I would like to remind them that the medications that they're taking today have come to be approved through the participation of other patients with CF that have gone through the process of participation in clinical trials. And as a result of that, now these medications are available. And I think that the key for participation is for the patient that will become a subject of a study is to feel comfortable with uh, the activities that entail the specific research study, and sometimes depends on your experience. Some they've never participated before because of different reasons, and maybe observational studies are ideal where there are the research visits, but there might not be that much activity. Or sometimes you are motivated by some specific problem that is affecting you, such as an infection. And Dr. Wojciechowski sort of alluded to some of that. But even, the anti-inflammatory therapies that in a way are uh, agnostic of what type of mutation you have, because the process, although it's improved with current therapies, it's not completely eliminated. So I think it is a personal decision, but I always try to kind of remind about what they're using and how those came about.
I agree. I think there are a couple of things. I think one, to Dr. Berlinski's last point, is modulator therapy has been incredible, overall incredible. But I think what we're seeing like over time, right, and I think is that there are still positive cultures. There are still issues with exacerbations. There are still issues with inflammation that are ongoing. So this is not all perfectly addressed by the current modulator therapy. And so I think just that in and of itself is just reminding and having discussions about that there's still so much, there's still room for us to advance and for us to get better treatments out for everyone. And so I think that's a big part of it. Our modulator therapies in their current form, probably the end all of where we are. No, we are poised to continue to push things forward and for things to get better. And we can only do that with different trials and different research studies to further our understanding. And so I do talk about that. And I do just, again, everything is a personal journey, but I also like to talk about just the general other benefits that I find that are really rewarding from being involved in trials with our center. A lot of it is just a sense of being really giving back to our community, working with the team, helping to drive things forward. I think that's a very rewarding relationship, and especially when we still just have ways to improve and ways to keep on going.
We've got a couple of related questions. The first I'm going to direct to Dr. Berlinski. It's in relation to your discussion. The question centers around patient participation in earlier phases of trials and the ability whether or not patients could be involved in subsequent study rounds, like if they were in a phase 2, could they be involved in the phase 3, et cetera, especially if they have a perceived positive response from the therapy they got during the trial. And what are the limitations for that in the current pipeline?
So it depends on what type of studies are we talking. I think that you'll probably discuss with next next town hall about the limitations on gene therapy,
Right.
of participation on one trial and how to move forward. And many patients advanced that have been part of the modulator therapies that have been part of the phase 2 and have been later participated in phase 3 as well.
If I might add, the neutrophil elastase inhibitor studies were mentioned, and where they have probably made more progress to date has been in the non-CF bronchiectasis world. And I can tell you, we were hit by some patients who had a perceived benefit from at least trial participation in the phase 2 trials that we were conducting at our site. And unfortunately, those patients, many of them asked to roll over into the phase 3, were unable to participate, mostly because some of those contingencies are put in place by the FDA and other labeling organizations, because they want to have a certain number of unique patients studied throughout, especially if the efficacy endpoints are being used heavily from the phase 2 trials to foreshorten or to minimize the number of patients that have to be in the phase 3 trials, or the number of phase 3 trials that have to be conducted. That may sound a little bit like gibberish, but the conclusion from that is that sometimes those are done by the FDA in coordination with the community and patients and others to allow for the trials to move more quickly, and hopefully to get drugs, especially in what are termed orphan diseases like cystic fibrosis. In other words, diseases that have severe illnesses that are not affecting many patients, but have a severe phenotype or outcomes for the patients. And so therefore, they try to expedite this as much as possible where it's possible from a safety standpoint. So sometimes those limitations are put in place, especially to be able to expedite the overall trial process to get those drugs to patients faster, or at least get them evaluated faster for potential approval. Thanks for those responses. I want to turn to a question that we got about observational studies, sort of related to that. And I'll direct this to you, Dr. Bojanowski, since you talked about observational studies. The first part of the question it really centers around what should be patients and people with CF's motivation to participate in observational studies. What's the kind of general learning that happens with those types of trials? And should patients participate in those, given that there may or may not, or maybe you can answer whether or not they would be able to participate in concomitant therapeutic trials while being involved with observational studies. Can you answer those questions for us?
Yeah, of course. I think one of the big things, like I was kind of mentioning, observational studies are incredibly important. They're incredibly important because they give researchers just a wealth of knowledge about and a better understanding of what challenges people may be facing, what patterns we may be seeing. It helps drug developers determine the targets that would be most appropriate. And if that's through, blood work or, just different timelines, whatever it may be, where we can get those signals. So it's really, the studies are really, really important. And I think one of the big drivers that, at least for, that I would say would just be helping just the larger community, right? And it is kind of just helping just add to more information and helping to add a better understanding. And so, and for the most part, observational studies, in general, don't stretch too far beyond standard of care. So it's not like you necessarily need to have many more visits or study visits. Sometimes they can just coincide with your, you try to overlap, with regular study visit or regular clinical visits. And so a lot of times that is the case for the observational studies. It may include some more blood draws or, what different specifics for different studies, for example. But a lot of times it is just more reporting and following standard of care. But again, I think that's the big thing, is just talking about helping us and researchers to understand problems better so that we can come up with better targets.
I would like to add that also these type of studies are more of a real life study, and it's a little bit different from the process of the other trials where are very specific, and each of the different components is very regulated. And many of these studies have occurred before or right at the time of starting a new modulator therapies. And I think that there is a lot to learn. I think if we think about how long it's happened since the approval of Trikafta, for example. So it's been only 4 years. And 4 years in, we sort of also need to learn what happened after you take it for 10 years, or what happens if you started taking when you are very young, as opposed to when you were taking it older. So I think that I always say that we are learning along with our patients what this new CF care is, and what we thought the response would be to an infection or to any other problem. Now we are sort of learning together how they're going to react given the amount of correction that they receive of their CFTR function that they receive from these new therapies. And I think they are also ideal to be kind of the first introduction to research. And I think that it is fulfilling to know that your participation will contribute to learn more about CF care, specifically on some of these items that have been discussed earlier.
Mm-hmm. And
those
one
are
of
great
the,
points.
oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
go ahead.
And I was just going to say, to the second part of that question, one of the things that's pretty unique about observational studies, because really the goal is just to add more information and better understanding. One nice thing is there's never really, I can never think of a time where you would be excluded from multiple observational studies, right? So you can participate in multiple observational studies without conflict. And many times it's very specific, but you're not necessarily excluded from potential interventional trials. Is that right? I mean, I think that
it's dependent upon the observational study.
Very dependent, exactly.
But in some instances, exclusion from that would be there'd be an ethical dilemma. So,
right.
I would say that it is not universally a no. It's not universally a yes.
Correct.
Rather, with an observational study, the likelihood of being able to participate in a therapeutic trial is much higher. And I can tell you the CF research community has pushed for that, and that has been an issue brought by our patient advocates who sit on like the protocol review committee to please consider the capacity or flexibility for patients to be involved with therapeutic trials if they choose to be on an observational study. For instance, the PROMISE study is one of the longer observational studies that's been conducted to date. It's in its third and a half, fourth year now, and we have allowed some of that in certain instances because things change a lot in that long time frame, in that long period of observation. Mm-hmm. I want to conclude with a question that kind of we had been bouncing back and forth amongst us before, the concept of how drugs and initial compounds are selected to go into the pipeline. See if either of you can give us a little bit of insight into how that happens. That can be illustrative for patients to understand how drugs start their lifespan out in the pipeline.
Yeah, I think one of the big things is the therapeutics development network, right? And that's such a benefit for the CF community that we're able to take advantage of. Not only does it promote research and the referral process and just awareness, but also there's a really good type of internal and strong review. And so to get put on the CF research pipeline, it has to be reviewed by the TDN. I don't know how much detail. But
well, that's okay. I think we talked a good bit about the TDN at the previous town hall and its role in, ensuring safety, but also, it's not just safety, there's also likelihood of success of the therapy, both in the initial phases and, how is the sponsor going to be a good advocate for the community and can proceed the drug through the phases if it's successful and that kind of thing. So as a result of those processes, I think what it starts out in the pipeline is enriched in more likelihood of success, albeit, as we discussed earlier, many drugs still don't make it out of the CF pipeline to patients, but the chances of success, at least to progress somewhat in the pipeline, are higher because of the initial efforts that are put in on the earlier phases. I want to conclude, we're about at the hour, and ask if you all have either of you have any closing thoughts, and to offer my thanks again for both of you giving excellent presentations tonight.
I would just would encourage patients and families to think about participating in research, and at least to start discussing this in your visits in the CF clinic, and ask about what's out there for me. And you never know, you might find many patients, and we had many patient testimonials that it's just very refreshing how enthusiastic they are about their participation, and they just come back for the next one. And this is just something that I guess that you sort of grow into through the simplest study to more complex studies.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think one other point is that it's actually the current guidelines for standard of care for CF in adult and pediatric care really advocate for research discussion to be part of the visits. So that should and is appropriate to be part of many of the routine clinical care visits. So, bring it up, ask your teams to be, referring you if you're interested, or at least what's out there, even if you're not per se interested in research, at this time, but just so you're aware of what's happening. It's definitely part of the good care for CF centers as well. So I'm going to conclude and say thank you all very much. We really appreciate your attendance, and look forward to seeing you on the final webinar on October 5th.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.